Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Franklin Roosevelt, and the focus is following TR's path to politics. The year is 1904. Roosevelt is recently a Harvard graduate. He's recently married. What's next for him? He is thinking public service. For that, he's thinking the path law school. Not going to go back to Harvard, decides to keep the family in the New York City area. He enrolls in Columbia Law School, which he never really cares for. In fact, he misses 73 days of classes in his first year alone. He actually fails 2 courses that he had to make up the following summer. Eventually passed the bar in New York in 1907, having never finished his education at Columbia, but he had the credential he needed to go to work. He's 25 years old. He signs on as an unpaid apprentice at the law firm Carter, Elliott, and Milburn, working mostly behind the scenes, again as a junior attorney. Second year, he works in the Admiralty Division, gets a little bit more experience, but he's really looking out for other things and other areas of interest, including his social status as a Roosevelt. He joins the Knickerbocker Club, the New York Yacht Club, the University Club, where he tended to play poker on Saturdays, recreation, lots of golf and tennis for Franklin Roosevelt. As for his goals, well, it's to follow in the footsteps of the man he's now calling Uncle Ted, Theodore Roosevelt, who's currently the President of the United States and the uncle of his wife, Eleanor. Well, Uncle Ted had a path to prominence, and Grenville Clark was a colleague at the law firm with Franklin Roosevelt, and he said, look, I remember him saying with engaging frankness, he wasn't going to practice law forever. He intended to run for office at the first opportunity, and he thought he had a real chance to be president. I remember he described very accurately the steps which he thought could lead to this goal. They were first, a seat in the state assembly, then an appointment as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, finally the governorship of New York. I don't recall that any of us deprecated his ambition. It seemed proper and sincere, and moreover, as he put it, entirely reasonable. Partly reasonable because it had been done before. All of those jobs had been held by the current president, Theodore Roosevelt, on his path to prominence. Well, the first opportunity for Franklin Roosevelt to run for office came in 1910. Judge John Mack was a friend of Roosevelt's, and he said, look, I'm hearing that Louis Chanler, our state assemblyman, is going to retire, opening up a seat. Why don't you make the run? And Roosevelt's excited about this until Chanler decides, nah, you know what? Change my mind. I'm going to run anyway. So Franklin Roosevelt's disappointed. He's trying to think, well, what could I do? Is there something else to run for? And the opening potentially for a Democrat might be in the state Senate. The problem is a Democrat hadn't won in Roosevelt's district since before the Civil War, over 50 years before. Nevertheless, Roosevelt decides to make his best effort and make that run. He runs an aggressive campaign. His goal, meet everybody in the district, have those personal connections, personal relationships being key to the politics of Franklin Roosevelt. That's a large area to cover. So he rents a red Maxwell convertible, $20 a day, big money at those days, and he was going to go out and meet as many people as he could. Now, this is a little bit risky because the farmers populated much of this district didn't really care for these automobiles. They would kick up all this dust and scare the horses. But truth is, this worked because Roosevelt got to meet so many of these farmers. He endeared themselves to them. He listened to their issues and, of course, talked about his own agenda, which really had one prominent theme. Now, he was a progressive in general, but the main thing he was going to do, he was going to go after the political machine. The key for Roosevelt was his independence. I am pledged to no man, he would say on the campaign trail. I am influenced by no specific interest, and so I shall remain. He was there for his constituents. This was tricky in New York because Tammany Hall, the political machine in New York City, and really dominated politics for the Democratic Party throughout the entire state, very powerful to go up against. Their boss, Charlie Murphy. As far as Roosevelt was concerned, it's time for a change. C.F. Murphy and his kind must, like the noxious weed, be plucked out. From the ruins of the political machines, we will construct something more nearly conforming to a democratic conception of government. Comes down to a close vote. Franklin Roosevelt prevails, gets about 52% of the vote. Now, typically, the legislative session in the state of New York at the time lasted only about 10 weeks, right at the beginning of every calendar year. This one would be different, thanks very much to Franklin Roosevelt. The number one job for the new legislature in New York to deal with is to fill the U.S. Senate seat, being emptied or let go by Chauncey Depew, a Republican who was stepping down. Democrats now dominate both houses of the state legislature. They basically get to pick who the new senator is going to be, and Tammany Hall was putting forward William Sheehan. They expected everybody else to just get in line. Well, Franklin Roosevelt was opposed to the machine, and he was opposed to Sheehan. So he got about 20 of the legislators to skip the party caucus so they could preserve their independence when it came time to vote. They decided to pitch a different candidate, the former mayor of Brooklyn, Edward Shepard. They all came to vote for the first time. Well, the Republicans and the insurgents under Roosevelt had enough votes so that Sheehan could not get a majority. No one wins the seat, and now we're starting to have an impasse. In fact, at the FDR home became the headquarters of this insurgency, where all the 20 would gather every morning. They would get together, they would talk about some stories, and when it was time to vote, they would all walk to the Capitol together. They would cast their vote. No one would win. They would go back to the Roosevelt home, where they would again tell stories until all afternoon and well into the evening, smoke their cigars and cigarettes. In fact, there was so much smoke, Eleanor had to move the family nursery up a flight of stairs because so much smoke was coming up from the library below. Yes, the Roosevelts did have 3 children at this point. Anna was the oldest, followed by James. Franklin Jr. had actually died in infancy, and along came Elliott, the 3rd child, just the previous year. Now, there were carrots and sticks being floated at these insurgent politicians, patronage benefits if they get in line. They're threatening them, both with political retribution as well as personal business retribution if these guys don't get in line and join the candidate coming from Tammany Hall. Well, Franklin Roosevelt, to his credit, kept this insurgency together. They were very tight. They were united. They were not giving in, to the point where Boss Murphy actually asked for a meeting with Roosevelt at the end of January. They met. Nothing changed. As far as Roosevelt said, there is nothing I love as much as a good fight. I've never had as much fun in my life as I am having right now, sounding an awful lot like Uncle Ted, Theodore Roosevelt, the current president of the United States. Well, this was, again, pretty much fun for Roosevelt, but not really much for anybody else, because no business was getting done in the state until they elect this senator. And then there was a fire in the state house. Everybody is really ornery. They don't have a place to meet. The governor is pushing for a budget, the more important thing for him. A lot of pressure on the insurgents, but also pressure on Sheehan to say, maybe you need to withdraw. Well, Tammany Hall's good at what it did. They did get Sheehan to withdraw, and they replaced him with their candidate by the name of James O'Gorman. Now, O'Gorman had spent the last 10 years at the state Supreme Court, where basically unassailable integrity, but he also happened to be a former leader of Tammany Hall. Well, at this point, the insurgents really didn't have a choice. They didn't have a case to make against O'Gorman. He was pretty much lock solid in terms of qualifications, and so they gave in. O'Gorman becomes the senator, kind of win the battle for Roosevelt, lose the war. In fact, because Tammany Hall still got its candidate in there, this would not be the last time that Roosevelt and Tammany Hall would be at odds. Now, whenever you take on Tammany Hall in New York, it becomes big news. In fact, it can become national news. Biggest takeaway for Roosevelt was a note from his now former president, Theodore Roosevelt, who told him that, look, just a line to say that we are all really proud of the way you have handled yourself. Something like that obviously meant a lot to Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt was not very active as a legislator, generally reliable as a progressive vote. He cared a lot about conservation. Not really a big leader when it came to introducing and pushing bills. His eye very much on the future, and the Republican Party, the opposition, very much in shambles, a large part because of Theodore Roosevelt. He basically broke the Republican Party as he decided to turn against his handpicked successor, William Taft. That's going to break things wide open. Whoever can win the Democratic nomination for president, pretty good chance of winning. Well, Franklin Roosevelt decided to put his eggs in the basket of Woodrow Wilson, the new governor of New Jersey, a progressive. He had taken on the party bosses, the political machines. Roosevelt goes to Trenton, New Jersey to visit with Wilson. They talk about Wilson's chances in New York. Now, Roosevelt's clear. He says, look, you're probably not going to win New York on the nomination at the Democratic Convention. Tammany Hall, the political machines are against you, but I'm still willing to try to lead and get a contingent of Wilson supporters in New York if you want me to. Wilson said yes, so Roosevelt sets up the New York State Wilson Conference. He leads about 150 New Yorkers to Baltimore for the National Convention. Now, the front runner for the Democratic nomination was not Woodrow Wilson. He was one of the front runners, but really on the top of the list was the Speaker of the House, Champ Clark. Wilson kind of number 2. For the first 29 ballots at the convention, Clark was in the lead. In fact, he had a majority for part of that time, but he could never get to the 2/3 supermajority threshold needed at Democratic conventions. At the 30th ballot, things flipped. Wilson took the lead. He goes over the top, gets the nomination on the 46th ballot, and Franklin Roosevelt is thrilled. The problem for Roosevelt is he gets sick. He's unable to stump for Wilson or even for his own re-election because he contracts typhoid. He needs some help. He turns to a longtime political reporter, currently working for the New York Herald by the name of Louis Howe. Howe was curmudgeonly, testy, a chain smoker, a diehard politician, a junkie. He always thought he could run a campaign better than the people that he covered, so he jumps at the chance to work for Roosevelt. He turns out to be a publicity machine. He takes out full-page ads in the newspaper, which is very strange for at the state Senate level for an election, gets Roosevelt to sign thousands of letters that are sent out to potential voters and supporters in the Democratic Party. It all worked. Roosevelt is reelected, seals that relationship with Howe essentially for life, and now he wants to seal the deal with the president-elect Woodrow Wilson, who wins the general election campaign for the presidency. He wants more than anything else to follow in Theodore's footsteps to become the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Now, the Secretary of the Navy is going to be a newspaper man from North Carolina, Josephus, who Roosevelt had actually met and got to be friendly with at the Democratic Convention. Well, for the inauguration, Roosevelt travels to Washington, D.C., and the first person he really runs into of note is the man who's going to be Secretary of the Treasury, William McAdoo. And McAdoo's impressed with Roosevelt. He offers him to be the Assistant Secretary or maybe the Collector of the Port of New York, very prominent jobs, but Roosevelt's flattered, but he demurs. He wants to be Assistant Secretary of the Navy, so he is thrilled when he actually runs into Daniels, and Daniels offers him the job. His response, again, sounding a lot like TR, "I would like it bully well. It would please me better than anything in the world. I'd be glad to be connected with the new administration. All my life I have loved ships and have been a student of the Navy, and the assistant secretaryship is the one place above all others I would love to hold." Daniels takes the recommendation to President Wilson. He agrees. Roosevelt is confirmed, sworn into the office on March the 17th, 1913. Oh, nice way to celebrate his 8th wedding anniversary. The family's moving to Washington, D.C. FDR's political career is going national. That's the story for another day. That is Franklin Roosevelt following TR's path to politics from the life of Franklin Roosevelt. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.